The night I signed the paperwork for $4.7 million, I was sitting in my car in the parking garage of my attorney's office, eating a gas station sandwich, wearing the same scrubs I'd worked a 12-hour shift in. That's the detail nobody ever believes. $4.7 million? And I couldn't even afford to be hungry somewhere nice. I didn't tell anyone, not my mother, not my sister, definitely not my brother and his wife, who had been making it clear for the better part of a decade that I was the family's greatest disappointment. I want to back up, because to understand what I did next, you have to understand what it felt like to be me for the 10 years before that moment. My name is Wren. I'm 31 years old, and I have been a registered nurse since I was 23. I work nights at a Level 2 trauma center outside of Columbus, Ohio. It is not glamorous work. It does not come with the kind of salary that impresses anyone at Thanksgiving. My hands are always slightly dry from the constant washing and gloving. I sleep strange hours, and for most of my adult life, the nicest thing my family said about my career was that at least it was stable. My brother, Kevin, is 4 years older than me and has spent his entire life being everything my family wanted. He married well, at least in their eyes. His wife, Denise, comes from money, the quiet kind where nobody talks about it, but everyone notices. Kevin runs a small commercial real estate business that my mother describes to her friends as very successful, though I've seen enough of the books over the years to know that afloat would be more accurate. They have a beautiful house in a suburb my mother can brag about, 2 kids who wear monogrammed everything, and a lifestyle that costs considerably more than it produces. My mother lives 20 minutes from Kevin. She has since my dad passed, 6 years ago now. After the funeral, it was just understood, never discussed, just understood, that Kevin's household was where she'd anchor. He was the one who had made something of himself. I was the one who had chosen, as my mother once put it, to work with 6 strangers instead of building a real life. I heard that sentence for the first time when I was 25, and I turned it over in my mind every few months for years afterward, like a stone you can't stop touching. Here's what they never saw, or maybe never wanted to see. I showed up. Every time something broke, I was there. When my mother had her hip replaced, I took 2 weeks of PTO and moved into her guest room to manage her medications, her physical therapy schedule, her follow-up appointments. Kevin sent flowers and called twice. When my niece had a fever of 104 on a Sunday night and Denise was panicking, I drove 40 minutes in the rain and sat with that little girl for 3 hours until her fever broke. I was not thanked so much as I was tolerated. Wren is good in a crisis, my mother used to say, as if that were a lesser trait, something you needed only occasionally, like a fire extinguisher. The money came from a lawsuit. I need to explain this clearly, because it's important and because I've seen what happens when people assume the worst. 3 years ago, I was rear-ended at a red light by a driver who ran it at close to 40 miles per hour. I was in my car on the way home from a night shift. The impact fractured 2 vertebrae in my lower back. I spent 11 days in the hospital, 4 months in physical therapy, and nearly a year in varying degrees of pain that I still haven't fully described to anyone because nurses make terrible patients when it comes to admitting how much something hurts. The driver was uninsured, but the trucking company whose vehicle he was operating at the time of the accident, it's a long story involving a contract dispute and whether he was technically on duty, ultimately settled rather than go to trial. My attorney, who I found through a coworker and who turned out to be exceptional, negotiated a settlement that I never expected. $4.7 million. Net of fees and taxes set aside, I walked away with just under $3 million in liquid assets and a structured annuity that pays out monthly for the next 20 years. The night I signed the paperwork, I sat in that parking garage for a long time. I thought about calling my mother. I thought about calling Kevin. And then I thought about every single time I had needed something and what had happened, and I put my phone in my cup holder and drove home. I did not tell a single person. I kept going to work. I kept living in my same apartment. I drove the same car with the dent in the rear bumper that I'd been meaning to fix. I continued splitting the cost of a Hulu account with my coworker Simone, who also happened to be my closest friend in the world and the only person I was genuinely tempted to tell. I didn't, not yet, because I was still figuring out what I wanted to do, and I knew that Simone, who is the most emotionally honest person I've ever met, would immediately ask me what I was going to do about my family. And I wasn't ready to answer that. What I was doing in those quiet weeks after the settlement was watching. I had always been watching, really. Nursing teaches you to observe without tipping your hand. You notice things. Tone shifts, micro expressions, the particular way someone avoids your eyes when you ask them a direct question. I had been cataloging my family's behavior for years without fully admitting to myself that's what I was doing. Now I watched with intention. Kevin called me twice in the 2 months after my settlement. Both times were because he needed something. The first call was to ask if I could look into a medication my mother had been prescribed and whether there was a cheaper generic. He didn't ask how I was healing. He didn't mention my back. The second call was to tell me that Denise's mother was coming to stay and they needed the guest room, and could my mother come stay with me for a week, even though I lived 45 minutes away and worked nights? Which made caring for a 67-year-old woman in a one-bedroom apartment a logistical nightmare. I said I would think about it. My mother called me more frequently, but the calls had a particular shape to them. She would open with about 4 minutes of genuine conversation. How I was sleeping, whether I was eating, and then we'd arrive, inevitably, at the real subject, which was usually Kevin's finances, Kevin's stress, or the various pressures of Kevin's life presented in a way that suggested I should feel bad for him. He was under a lot of strain. The market was difficult. Denise was anxious about their property tax assessment. I listened. I made the appropriate sounds. I did not say anything about my own financial situation, which by then included a money market account that would have made every one of these conversations irrelevant. There was a specific moment that clarified everything for me. It was a Tuesday in October, about 6 weeks after my settlement. I had just worked 3 night shifts back to back, and I was tired in the way that goes past your body and into somewhere deeper. My mother called around noon when she knew I'd be sleeping, and I let it go to voicemail. When I listened to it, it was 11 seconds long. She said, "Wren, it's Mom. Kevin says you're not returning his emails about the family reunion deposit. Can you just handle it? He's busy." I lay there in my dark bedroom and I listened to that message twice. I had been in a serious accident. I had fractured my spine. I had spent months relearning how to stand without pain. I had never once received a message from my mother that said, "Wren, Kevin says you haven't been thanked properly. Can we fix that?" I got up, made coffee, and started planning. I want to be honest about what the test was because I've told this story to a few people since, and the reactions are split. Some people think what I did was cruel. Some people think it was exactly right. I've made my peace with both responses. I decided to create a financial emergency, not a medical one. I'd thought about that and dismissed it, partly because medical crises are unpredictable, and partly because I am, at my core, a nurse. And something about faking a health emergency felt deeply wrong to me. What I chose instead was something that, for my family, would be almost as alarming. I told them I was about to lose my apartment. I called my mother on a Thursday evening. I kept my voice steady because I know how to keep my voice steady. I told her that my apartment complex had been sold to a new management company, that they were converting the building to condos, and that I had 30 days to find somewhere to go. I told her my savings were nearly gone because of some bills I'd had trouble catching up on after the accident, which was, ironically, the truest part of the whole story, since before the settlement that had been genuinely true. I said I needed either a place to stay for a few weeks or help covering a deposit on a new place, about $1,500. There was a pause. My mother said, "Have you tried calling the leasing office to see if they have any other properties?" I said I had. I said there was nothing in my price range. Another pause. She said, "I'll mention it to Kevin. He might know someone." She did not say, "Come stay here." She did not say, "I'll help you." She did not say, "We'll figure it out together." She said she would mention it to Kevin. I thanked her and got off the phone. Kevin texted me 2 days later. The text said, "Mom told me what's going on, that's rough. Have you looked into income-based housing assistance? There are programs for that." I put my phone face down on my counter and stood there for a moment. Income-based housing assistance. I am a registered nurse with a decade of experience and a certification in trauma care, and my brother, who had borrowed money from our father's estate before the will even settled, suggested I apply for income-based housing assistance. I called Denise next. I didn't have high hopes, but I wanted to complete the picture. Denise and I have never been close, but she has always presented herself as warm, as caring, as the kind of woman who coordinates neighborhood food drives and sends handwritten thank you notes. I wanted to see what happened when warmth was actually required. Denise answered on the third ring. She sounded distracted. I explained the situation again, the same story, the same details. I asked if there was any chance I could stay in their guest room, the one that had 3 months ago been prioritized for her mother, while I found a new place. She said the kids had been using it as a playroom. She said it was really not a great time. She said, "I'll keep my ears open for anyone renting nearby." And she said it with such genuine-sounding warmth that for just a second, I almost believed she meant it. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat down on my kitchen floor, not dramatically, just because it was the closest surface, and I allowed myself to feel it for exactly 10 minutes. The particular grief of being unsurprised by people you wanted to be wrong about. Then I got up and I called Simone. Now I need to tell you about Simone, because she is the entire reason the story ends the way it does. Simone and I met on our first day of orientation at the hospital 7 years ago. She is from rural West Virginia. She is 33 years old. She wears her hair in 2 braids when she's working and lets it loose on her days off, and she has the kind of laugh that makes other people in restaurants turn around to find the source of it. She is also, in terms of practical financial circumstances, genuinely struggling in ways that I had been pretending to struggle. Simone is the sole support for her younger brother, who has a developmental disability and lives in a supported housing program that costs more than most people's mortgages. She has been working doubles twice a week for 3 years to cover the gap between what his program costs and what his Medicaid waiver covers. She drives a 2013 Honda Civic with 200,000 miles on it, and she packs her lunch every single day because the hospital cafeteria is, in her words, a luxury I can't subsidize. When I called her that evening and told her my fake housing crisis, I framed it carefully. I said I was embarrassed to ask. I said I knew she was stretched thin. I said I didn't expect anything, I just didn't know who else to call. What Simone said was, "Okay, how much do you need and when do you need it by?" No hesitation, not a single beat. I told her $1,500 for a deposit. I told her I could pay her back within the month. She said, "I have just about that in my emergency fund. I've been rebuilding it since Marcus's program fee went up. I'll transfer it tonight. What's your Venmo?" I started crying before she finished the sentence. Simone, who budgeted every single grocery purchase, who had been rebuilding her emergency fund dollar by dollar, who had a brother who needed that money to exist safely in the world, was going to empty it for me without asking me to justify myself. I told her the truth right then. I couldn't let it go another second. I told her everything. The settlement, the amount, the months of silence, the test, the calls, Kevin's text about income-based housing, Denise's playroom. There was a long quiet on the line. Then Simone said, "Wren, you have $3 million. Yes, and you let Kevin tell you to apply for housing assistance." I wanted to see. Another pause. And then she laughed, and it was the full laugh, the one that makes strangers in restaurants turn around, and she said, "Okay, what are we doing with this information? Here's what I decided to do. I want to be clear that I am not someone who enjoys conflict or spectacle. I didn't want a dramatic scene. I didn't want to humiliate anyone, exactly. What I wanted was clarity, for myself as much as for them. I wanted the moment to be undeniable, because I knew that without that, they would find a way to revise it. Kevin would say he would have helped if he'd known it was serious. My mother would say she was just trying not to overstep. Denise would say she wished she'd known the full picture. I wanted to remove every possible exit from revision. I asked Kevin and Denise to meet me for dinner. I said I had something important to discuss. I told my mother the same thing and asked her to come as well. I picked a restaurant that was nicer than anything we typically went to as a family, not ostentatiously expensive, just clearly, visibly above our usual register. I made a reservation and I arrived first and I was dressed well. Not lavishly, just well. Better than I usually looked when I saw them. Which wasn't hard given that they were accustomed to seeing me in scrubs or whatever I grabbed on 3 hours of sleep. My mother arrived and looked mildly confused by the surroundings. Kevin arrived looking distracted, the way he always looks, like there's a more important meeting he should be at. Denise arrived looking at her phone. We ordered, we made small talk. I let it breathe for a few minutes because I believe in letting people settle before you change the weather. Then I said, I want to update you all on my housing situation. It's resolved. Kevin nodded in the distracted way. Oh good, did you find a place? I'm actually buying a house, I said. I close in 3 weeks. My mother looked up. Buying? How are you? I settled my lawsuit, I said. The one from the accident. I settled it about 2 months ago. The table got quiet. How much? Kevin said. He said it before my mother could, before Denise could, before anyone had gathered enough social grace to frame it more delicately. Enough to buy a house outright, I said, and have quite a bit left over. I watched Denise's expression do something complicated. I watched my mother process it. I watched Kevin sit back in his chair in a way that I knew meant he was recalibrating. You should have told us, my mother said. Wren, we were worried. Were you? I said. It came out more quietly than I'd planned, which I think made it land harder. Because when I told you I was about to lose my apartment, you told me you'd mention it to Kevin. When I asked Kevin, he suggested income-based housing assistance. I looked at Denise. When I asked if I could stay in your guest room for a few weeks, you told me the kids were using it as a playroom. Nobody said anything. The only person who said yes immediately, I said, was Simone. She was going to send me her emergency fund that same night. She told me to send her my Venmo. She didn't ask me a single question first. Kevin said, you were testing us. I was giving you a chance, I said, and I meant that and I still mean it. I wasn't trying to build a case. I was hoping to be wrong. And I got my answer. The rest of dinner was uncomfortable in the particular way of dinners where the important conversation is already over and everyone is just eating through the aftermath. My mother cried a little and said she hadn't known I needed help, and I told her gently and without cruelty that she had known. I had told her, and that was the point. Kevin said he felt blindsided. I told him that was probably a useful feeling to sit with. What happened after the dinner is what I really want to tell you, because I think it's the part that matters. 2 days later, I called Simone and I asked her to come over. I made the lemon pepper chicken she likes, and I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving, and we sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours. I had done research. That's the thing about being a nurse, you learn to work a problem. I had spent time with a financial advisor and an attorney, and I knew exactly what I was able to do and what it would mean. I told Simone that I wanted to pay off her car. She started to say no, and I put my hand on hers and told her this wasn't charity, it was math, and that a car payment eating into her budget while she was covering Marcus's program fees was a problem I could solve in about 4 minutes, and that she was going to let me solve it. She cried. The kind of crying that's really just relief, the release of weight you've been carrying for so long you forgot it wasn't just part of your body. I also told her I'd spoken to a nonprofit that provides supplemental funding for supported living programs, and that I was making a donation in an amount that would cover Marcus's fee gap for the next 2 years. She didn't say anything for a long time after that. She just sat there with her hands around her wine glass and looked at the table. Finally, she said, "You know I would have sent you that money." "I know," I said. "That's why I bought my house. It's a 3-bedroom Craftsman in a neighborhood I've loved since I first moved to Columbus, with a porch that gets afternoon light and a backyard that my future dog is going to absolutely destroy. I close in 10 days. I have not invited my mother or Kevin and Denise to see it. That's not permanent, necessarily, but it's where I am right now. Some doors need to stay closed for a while before you can know whether you want to open them again. My mother calls weekly. The calls have changed in shape. There is less Kevin in them now. less instrumental undercurrent. Whether that's genuine or strategic, I can't fully tell yet, and I'm sitting with that uncertainty instead of forcing a resolution. Kevin sent me an email that was 2 paragraphs long and said essentially that he hoped we could move forward. I read it several times and I haven't responded yet. Denise sent me a text that said, "Thinking of you as you get settled. Shh." And I'll be honest, I laughed out loud in my car when I read it, and then I felt sad about it, and then I put my phone away and went grocery shopping. Simone came with me to look at furniture last weekend. She has strong opinions about couches. Too firm, she says, is a moral failing. And we spent 4 hours in 3 different stores and ended up finding a sectional that we both agreed was the right call, and the salesperson asked if we were sisters, and we both said yes at the same time. And then looked at each other, and it wasn't a joke exactly, it was just true. I am 31 years old. I have a fractured spine that healed imperfectly and still aches when the Ohio weather shifts. I have a job I am genuinely proud of, work that asks everything from me and occasionally gives it back. I have a house with afternoon light and a backyard waiting for a dog, and I have one person in my life who, when I called with a problem, said, "How much do you need and when do you need it by?" Everything else is still being sorted, but that one thing I know for certain is enough. I keep coming back to the parking garage, the fluorescent lights, the gas station sandwich, the paperwork sitting on my passenger seat worth more money than my entire family had collectively earned in a decade. And me, not calling anyone. People ask if I regret the test. I've thought about that question more than I expected to. What I've landed on is this. I didn't design the test to catch anyone. I designed it because I already knew the answer and I needed to stop pretending I didn't. There's a difference, and it matters to me. What Simone did that night wasn't a grand gesture in the way movies frame grand gestures. She didn't have extra. She had exactly enough to cover what I said I needed, and she was going to hand it over without a single qualifying question. That's not sentimentality, that's character. The kind that doesn't require an audience, the kind you only see clearly when the conditions are genuinely difficult. I have spent 10 years in a hospital watching people under pressure, and I can tell you that who someone is when things get hard is who they actually are. Simone at her most stretched was still entirely herself. That's the rarest thing I know. What my brother was at that moment was also entirely himself, and my mother, and Denise. I don't say that with bitterness anymore, or at least I'm working on not saying it with bitterness. The painful part wasn't that they failed some abstract moral test. The painful part was recognizing that they had been consistent all along, and I had been the one choosing not to see it clearly. That's on me. Part of growing up, I think, is accepting that seeing people accurately is an act of respect for them and for yourself. You stop asking people to be what they aren't, and you stop diminishing yourself to make the gap less visible. The settlement didn't change who I was. I want to be honest about that because I think there's a version of this story where the money is the point and it isn't. I was already someone who showed up. I was already someone who worked hard through pain and kept her mouth shut about it and packed her own lunch and made the decisions that needed making. The accident, the lawsuit, the years of physical therapy, none of that broke something in me that needed the money to repair. What the money did was remove the last excuse I had for tolerating dynamics that were costing me something I couldn't afford to keep losing, which was my own sense of what I was worth. That's the thing I'd want someone younger than me to hear, if they're in the middle of a version of this. Resilience isn't just getting through the hard thing. It's getting through the hard thing without letting it teach you that you deserve less. I let myself be the family's utility, useful in a crisis, invisible otherwise, for a long time. I told myself it was kindness. Some of it was, but some of it was fear dressed up as kindness, and it took a parking garage and a gas station sandwich and $4.7 million to make me finally tell the difference. I close on the house in 10 days. Simone already has opinions about the porch furniture. That's enough. It really is.